They slept curled at her bruised feet, snarled at any superior who raised a hand to her, and refused to be pried from her side. For 4 months, the Ironwood Ridge Pack whispered that the lowly Omega had used dark forbidden magic to bind the children to her. They were entirely wrong. The truth was far more dangerous. The Ironwood Ridge Pack operated out of a sprawling, heavily fortified estate nestled deep within the damp evergreen forests of Montana's Flathead Valley. To the human world, they were the board members and blue-collar workers of Ironwood Timber and Logistics, a multi-million-dollar logging empire built on old-growth cedar and Douglas fir. To the supernatural world, they were a brutal traditionalist pack ruled by Alpha Aldrich Vale, a man who ran his territory with an iron fist and a profound disdain for weakness. At the absolute bottom of Aldrich's hierarchy was Elara Brennan. 22 years old, petite, and perpetually exhausted, Elara was an Omega who bore the brunt of the pack's daily frustrations. Her parents had been low-ranking border patrols who died in a skirmish when she was just 16, leaving her with no dowry, no protection, and no standing. In a pack that valued sheer aggression and corporate ruthlessness, Elara was reduced to a glorified scullery maid. Her days were spent scrubbing the vast slate floors of the pack house, laundering the blood-stained clothing of the enforcers, and keeping her head bowed to avoid the cruel taunts of high-ranking females like Vivian Cross, the lead enforcer's mate. The morning started like every other morning in Elara's personal hell. 4 in the morning. The boiler room alarm clock rattled against the concrete floor, its piercing shriek cutting through the darkness. Elara's hand shot out from beneath the thin wool blanket, slapping the rusted metal silent. She lay still for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of mineral-heavy water and old pipes. The windowless room was her bedroom, her sanctuary, her prison. 8 feet by 10 feet of cramped space dominated by the estate's massive water heaters and a tangle of copper piping that groaned and hissed throughout the night. But she wasn't alone. 3 small bodies were curled against her on the narrow cot. Prince Finn, 7 years old, had his back pressed against the wall, one thin arm draped protectively over Elara's shoulder. Princess Sage 5 was tucked into the curve of Elara's stomach, her small fingers clutching a ragged piece of burnt fabric. Prince Ash, barely 3, was sprawled across Elara's legs, his cherubic face peaceful in sleep, thumb lodged firmly in his mouth. Elara carefully extracted herself from the tangle of limbs, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had learned that noise brought punishment. She pulled on her stained work dress, the fabric rough against her skin, and tied her dark hair back with a frayed ribbon. The bruises on her feet throbbed as she stepped into her worn canvas shoes. New bruises layered over old ones, a permanent map of violence that never quite faded. Vivian Cross had thrown a bucket of scalding mop water on Elara's feet 2 days ago. The blisters were still raw. Elara kissed each child's forehead, lingering over Ash's soft curls. They stirred but didn't wake. Good. They needed the rest. The dark veins that spiderwebbed beneath Sage's pale skin seemed more prominent this morning, pulsing faintly with an unnatural rhythm. Elara's chest tightened with worry, but she forced the fear down. Worry wouldn't help. Work would. If she finished her task quickly, she could steal extra food from the kitchen before the morning patrol returned. The pack house was a sprawling 3-story mansion of rough-hewn timber and local stone built to withstand Montana's brutal winters. Elara moved through the dim corridors like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the slate floors she'd scrubbed smooth over 6 years of servitude. The grand staircase dominated the main hall, a sweeping curve of polished wood that led to the Alpha's private quarters. It took Elara 90 minutes to scrub it properly on her hands and knees, one step at a time. She was halfway through the task when Vivian Cross appeared at the top of the landing. Vivian was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, ice-blonde hair, pulled into a severe knot, and pale green eyes that glittered with casual cruelty. She wore designer yoga pants and a cashmere sweater that cost more than Elara had earned in her entire life. Her manicured nails drummed against the banister as she descended, each click of her heels on the wood a small declaration of dominance. Elara kept her eyes down, focusing on the grain of the wood beneath her scrub brush. Don't engage. Don't react. Don't give her an excuse. Vivian stopped 3 steps above her, deliberately blocking the light from the chandelier. Her shadow fell across Elara like a physical weight. I'm missing a towel from the guest bathroom. Elara's hands stilled on the brush. Her heart kicked against her ribs, but she kept her voice level, respectful, empty of any emotion that could be construed as defiance. I'll check the laundry, ma'am. It may still be in the dryer. You think I'm stupid? Vivian's voice dropped to a dangerous purr. I counted them yesterday, 18 towels. This morning, 17. You gave one to those filthy brats you keep in the basement, didn't you? No, ma'am. Liar. Vivian's hands shot out, fingers tangling in Elara's hair, yanking her head back with enough force to make her neck crack. Elara gasped, her hands instinctively reaching up, but she didn't fight back. Fighting back only made it worse. Vivian leaned in close, her breath hot against Elara's ear. You think you're special because you play nursemaid to rogue trash. You're nothing, a floor scrubber. A waste of oxygen. When those pups finally die from whatever curse you've put on them, I'm going to make sure the Alpha tosses you out with their corpses. Vivian released her with a shove, and Elara's knees cracked against the edge of the step. Pain shot up her legs, sharp and bright. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper, forcing herself to remain still. Head bowed, hands folded in her lap like a supplicant. Vivian descended the rest of the stairs, pausing at the bottom to deliver her final blow. Oh, and the Alpha wants the floors in the Great Hall scrubbed before noon. On your hands and knees, Elara. I want to see you earn your keep. The Great Hall was 3,000 square feet of polished slate. Elara waited until Vivian's footsteps faded toward the east wing before allowing herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, counting to 10, then 20, waiting for the adrenaline to ebb. When she finally stood, her knees protested, stiff and aching. She'd have new bruises there by evening. She always did. But she'd won. She'd survived the encounter without giving Vivian an excuse to escalate, without drawing attention to the children sleeping in the boiler room. That was a victory. That was all she could hope for. Elara finished the staircase in silence, then hauled her bucket and brushes to the Great Hall. An hour later, pale light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the valley. The mountains were purple shadows against a steel-gray sky, their peaks still capped with last week's snow. Beautiful and indifferent, the world outside didn't care about omegas or orphans or the small, desperate acts of defiance that kept them alive. She was deep into her work when she heard the soft padding of bare feet behind her. Elara's head snapped up, her heart lurching into her throat. No, they were supposed to stay in the boiler room. They knew the rules. If anyone saw them during the working hours, but it was too late. Finn stood in the doorway, his thin frame silhouetted against the morning light. At 7 years old, he was small for his age, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. Malnutrition had stunted his growth, but it hadn't dimmed the fierce intelligence in his eyes. They were a dark, muddy gold in the dim light, watching Elara with an intensity that made her chest ache. Behind him, Sage peeked around the doorframe, her own eyes wide and worried. She had Ash's small hand clutched in hers, the toddler still half asleep, and rubbing his eyes with a chubby fist. Mama E, Finn whispered, using the name he'd given her 3 months ago. You didn't come back. Elara's throat tightened. She set down the scrub brush and held out her arms, and Finn crossed the room in 3 quick strides, pressing himself against her side. Sage followed more slowly, dragging Ash with her. The toddler made a small, happy sound and immediately climbed into Elara's lap, burying his face against her neck. His breath was warm and sweet, and Elara felt something in her chest crack open, flooding her with a fierce, protective love that made her ribs ache. I'm sorry, she murmured, pressing kisses to Ash's curls, reaching out to cup Sage's pale cheek. I'm sorry, my brave shadows. I had to start early today, but I'm here now, I'm here. Finn's small hand found hers, squeezing tight. His palm was hot against hers, too hot. Elara frowned, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. Fever, low grade but there. The poison was advancing again. She could see it in the faint tremor in his hands, the way his breath came just a little too fast. They needed to be close to her, needed her scent to stabilize them. But if anyone saw back to the room, Elara said softly urgent. Quickly now, before anyone, well. The voice cut through the hall like a whip crack. Beta Owen Cade stood in the entrance to the north corridor, his massive frame blocking the light. He was a mountain of a man, 6'5", and built like a brawler, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw. His mate Vivian might wield cruelty like a scalpel, but Owen preferred a sledgehammer. He crossed the hall in 4 long strides, his boots echoing on the slate Elara had just scrubbed. I thought Vivian told you to keep those mutts locked up. Elara scrambled to her feet, positioning herself between Owen and the children. Finn immediately pressed against her back, his small body vibrating with tension. Sage clutched Elara's skirt with both hands, and Ash whimpered, his fingers digging into Elara's shoulder. They're just children, Elara said quietly, keeping her eyes down. They weren't bothering anyone. They're bothering me. Owen loomed over her close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the faint metallic tang of blood on his clothes. He'd been on the morning patrol. Something had died in the woods. You got 10 seconds to get them back to the basement before I do it myself. And trust me, Omega, you don't want me touching your precious little pets. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady, submissive, carefully empty of defiance. Yes, Beta, right away. She turned, scooping Ash into her arms and reaching for Sage's hand. But Finn didn't move. He stood his ground, staring up at Owen with an expression that made Alara's blood run cold. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was a challenge, pure and primal, radiating from a 7-year-old boy who should have known better than to meet a Beta's eyes. Finn, Elara hissed, urgent and low. Finn, come on, now. But Finn's lips pulled back from his teeth, a low rumbling growl building in his narrow chest. It was absurd. He was a child barely 40 pounds, staring down a grown enforcer who could snap his neck with one hand. But the sound that came from Finn's throat was feral, wild, absolutely unafraid. Owen's eyes widened, surprise flickering across his brutal features before rage replaced it. You little— Owen's hands shot out, not for Finn, but for Elara. His fingers closed around her upper arm, yanking her forward hard enough to make her stumble. Ash shrieked, his small hands scrabbling for purchase, and Sage let out a high, thin wail of distress, and Finn moved. The 7-year-old boy launched himself at Owen's leg with a feral screech that echoed through the hall. His teeth sank into the meat of Owen's calf, right through the denim of his jeans, clamping down with the desperate strength of a child protecting his pack. Blood welled immediately, dark and wet, staining the fabric. Owen roared a sound of shock and fury, releasing Elara to reach for the boy attached to his leg. But before his hand could close around Finn's throat, Sage opened her mouth and screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was a focused, high-pitched sonic assault that vibrated through the air like a physical force. The crystal chandelier overhead shattered, raining glass down on the slate floor. The windows rattled in their frames. Owen staggered back, hands clapping over his ears, his face contorted in pain. And Ash, sweet, gentle Ash, who never made a sound, buried his face against Alara's neck and clung to her with such desperate strength that his small fingernails drew blood through her dress. Elara didn't think. She moved on pure instinct, scooping Finn away from Owen's leg and pressing all 3 children against her body, turning her back to the Beta to shield them. She felt Owen's hand close around the back of her neck, his grip crushing, lifting her partially off her feet. The children screamed, a cacophony of terror and rage, but Elara forced herself to go limp, to submit, to take the punishment so they wouldn't have to. Enough. The word was quiet, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. Owen's hand immediately released Alara's neck, and she dropped to her knees, gasping. She looked up, cradling the children against her chest, and saw Alpha Aldrich Vale standing in the doorway to his study. Aldrich was a man in his late 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines carved around his mouth and eyes. He wore a tailored suit despite the early hour, every inch the corporate executive. But his eyes were pure wolf cold and calculating, assessing the scene before him with the detached interest of a man watching insects fight in a jar. Owen stepped back immediately, his hands still pressed to his bleeding calf, his expression shifting from rage to carefully controlled deference. Alpha, I apologize for the disturbance. The Omega strays attacked me. Aldrich's gaze moved from Owen to Elara, lingering on the 3 children pressed against her. Finn was still growling, a continuous low rumble that vibrated through his entire body. Sage's eyes were wide and glassy, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Ash had gone completely silent, clinging to Elara like a barnacle, his small body trembling. It's unnatural. Owen continued, his voice tight with suppressed anger. She's cursed them. No right-minded wolf pup imprints on a floor scrubber. They should bow to their betters, not attack them. Aldrich tilted his head, considering. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of blood from Owen's leg onto the pristine slate floor Elara had just scrubbed. Then the Alpha smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Let the Omega play mother to the rogue trash, Aldrich said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. They fit perfectly together at the bottom of the barrel. As long as she keeps them out of sight and they don't interfere with pack business, I see no reason to intervene. Consider it entertainment. Owen's jaw clenched, but he bowed his head. Yes, Alpha. And Owen, Aldrich's smile widened, showing teeth. Next time you can't handle a 7-year-old child, I'll start questioning whether you're fit for your position. Understood. The Beta's face flushed, dark red humiliation and rage warring across his brutal features, but he kept his voice level, submissive. Understood, Alpha. Aldrich turned and walked back into his study, dismissing them all with his indifference. Owen stared at Elara for a long moment, his eyes promising future retribution before limping toward the infirmary. The moment he was gone, Elara sagged forward, her forehead pressing against Ash's curls, her entire body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. They'd survived. Again, barely. Finn's growling finally subsided, replaced by harsh, panting breaths. Elara pulled back enough to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You can't do that," she whispered fiercely. "Finn, you can't attack the enforcers. They'll kill you. Do you understand? They'll kill you, and I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't lose you." Finn's muddy gold eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his jaw was set with stubborn defiance. "He hurt you. I don't matter. You matter to us." Sage nodded solemnly, her small hand finding Elara's. And Ash, precious Ash, lifted his head from her shoulder, long enough to press a wet, sticky kiss to her cheek before burrowing back against her neck. Elara's eyes burned. She pulled all three children closer, breathing in their scent, smoke and pine, and something wild and undefined. They smelled wrong to the pack, their natural royal scent masked by months of poison saturating their systems. But to Elara, they smelled like home, like family, like everything worth protecting in a world that had taken everything else from her. "Come on," she murmured, standing on shaky legs. "Let's get you back to the room, and this time you stay there, promise me. No matter what you hear, no matter how long I'm gone, you stay there." Finn hesitated, then nodded. Sage clutched her burnt fabric tighter, and Ash simply held on his small body, warm and trusting, against hers. Elara carried them back through the corridors, down the narrow service stairs, into the basement's familiar concrete embrace. The boiler room was warm, the air thick with steam and the smell of heated metal. She settled the children on the cot, pulling the thin blankets around them, tucking them in with the practiced efficiency of 4 months' experience. "I'll be back soon," she promised, kissing each forehead again. "I'll bring breakfast, real breakfast, not just scraps, I promise." She waited until all three were settled before returning to the great hall. The shattered chandelier needed to be cleaned up before anyone else saw the damage. The blood on the floor needed to be scrubbed away. The evidence of their transgression needed to disappear. Elara worked in silence, sweeping up crystal shards with careful hands, mopping blood with cold water and vinegar. Her mind was elsewhere, running through the same calculations she'd been running for 4 months. The children were getting worse. The dark veins beneath Sage's skin were spreading, reaching toward her heart with slow, inexorable progress. Finn's fevers were more frequent, his appetite fading. Even Ash, who had been the healthiest when they'd arrived, was starting to show signs of decline. Lethargy, loss of weight, a faint grayish tint to his skin that hadn't been there last week. Elara didn't understand the biology of what was happening. She only knew that when the children were close to her, when they could breathe in her scent and touch her skin, they improved. The fevers receded, the veins faded, their appetites returned. It was as if her presence was a balm, a temporary relief from whatever sicknesses had taken root in their small bodies. But temporary wasn't enough. They needed a cure. They needed help. And Elara had no idea where to find it. She was on her knees scrubbing the last of the bloodstains from the slate when she heard the commotion from the front of the estate. Voices raised in excitement and alarm. The sound of vehicles on the gravel drive, doors slamming, boots on stone. Elara sat back on her heels, her heart sinking. Company. The pack rarely had visitors, and when they did, it meant double the work. Extra meals to prepare, guest rooms to clean, floors to polish. She'd be lucky to get back to the children before nightfall, but then she heard the name that made her blood run cold. "The Alphaking is coming." The words rippled through the estate like a shockwave. Elara saw pack members rushing past the great hall, their faces tight with panic. Beta Owen limped by, barking orders into his phone, his leg freshly bandaged. Vivian appeared in the doorway. Her usual composure shattered, her pale eyes wide. "Everyone to positions," Vivian snapped, her voice high and sharp. "The Alpha King's convoy will arrive within the hour. All Omegas and undesirables to the basement immediately. The Alpha wants only our best visible. Move." Alara's mind raced. The Alpha King, Kieran Thorne. She'd heard the stories whispered in the pack house late at night when the enforcers were drunk and the hierarchy forgot she was in the room. Kieran Thorne was not just a king. He was a walking natural disaster wrapped in bespoke Italian suits. As the CEO of Thorne Global, he controlled a massive portion of the North American supernatural economy. As the Alpha King, his authority was absolute, carved out over a decade of brutal warfare against rogue factions and traitorous pack leaders. And 6 months ago, his sister Princess Liana and her mate had been assassinated in a highly coordinated ambush near the Canadian border. The killers had burned the royal convoy to the ground, leaving no remains. Since then, Kieran had been tearing through the territories, hunting for the masterminds behind the treason. If he was coming here, it meant he suspected something. It meant danger. It meant Elara needed to get the children secured immediately. She abandoned her bucket and brush, hurrying toward the basement stairs. But Owen was there, his massive frame blocking the entrance, his expression carved from stone. "You heard Vivian," he growled. "Basement, now, and those mutts you keep down there, lock them in the boiler room and don't let them make a sound. If the king sees a single hair of those filthy runts, I will personally skin them, and you can watch. Do you understand me, Elara?" Alara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her face carefully blank, her voice soft and submissive. "Yes, Beta." Owen stepped aside and Elara descended into the basement's cool shadows. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat and her temples, in the tips of her fingers. The children were huddled on the cot when she entered the boiler room, their faces turned toward her with immediate desperate relief. "Mama E." "Shh." Elara gathered them close, speaking quickly and quietly. "Listen to me, my brave shadows. Someone very important is coming to the estate. Someone dangerous. We need to stay hidden, stay quiet, and stay together. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, you don't leave this room. Do you understand?" Finn's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why is he dangerous? Because he's an alpha, a king, and kings don't care about omegas or orphans. Elara smoothed Finn's hair back from his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. The fever was back stronger than before. "Please, Finn, for me, stay quiet and stay safe." Sage tugged on Alara's sleeve, her small voice barely a whisper. "Will you stay with us?" Alara's chest tightened. She wanted nothing more than to lock the door from the inside and keep the children wrapped in her arms until the danger passed. But she knew the pack house, knew the routines. If she disappeared during a royal visit, Vivian would come looking for her. And if Vivian found the children, "I'll come back as soon as I can." Elara promised, hating the lie even as it left her lips. "But I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that?" Sage nodded slowly. Ash whimpered, reaching for her, but Finn pulled his little brother back, his expression far too old for his 7 years. "We'll be brave," Finn said quietly. "But you come back, Mama E. You promised." "I always come back." Elara kissed each of them one last time, breathing in their scent, committing it to memory like a talisman against the fear building in her chest. Then she locked the heavy iron door from the outside, tested it twice to make sure it would hold, and hurried back upstairs. The estate was in controlled chaos. Pack members rushed from room to room, polishing surfaces that were already spotless, arranging furniture that was already perfectly aligned. Aldrich stood in the center of the great hall in a fresh suit, his hair slicked, back his expression carefully neutral. But Elara could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. He was afraid. They were all afraid. The convoy arrived exactly on time. Elara was in the kitchen helping the cook prepare canapes she would never be allowed to eat when she felt it. A wave of pressure that rolled through the estate like a physical force, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The ambient temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Every wolf in the building went still, heads turning toward the front entrance, bodies tensing in instinctive submission. The Alphaking had arrived. Even in the basement of the kitchen, separated by 2 floors and 100 feet of stone and timber, Elara could feel Kieran Thorne's presence. It was overwhelming, suffocating, a dense, crushing weight of ozone and dark pine and raw, undisputed dominance that made her knees weak and her omega instincts scream at her to drop to the floor and bare her throat. And in the boiler room, locked behind iron and stone, 3 children began to scream. The screams from the boiler room cut through Alara's consciousness like jagged glass. She dropped the tray of canapes she'd been arranging, the delicate pastries scattering across the kitchen floor. The cook turned to scold her, but Elara was already moving, shoving through the service door, her feet carrying her toward the basement stairs on pure maternal instinct. But Beta Owen was there, blocking her path with his massive frame. "Where do you think you're going?" "The children," Elara gasped, trying to push past him. "Something's wrong. I need to." Owen's hand closed around her throat, lifting her onto her toes. His breath was hot against her face, reeking of coffee and malice. "Those brats stay locked up. You stay up here. The king is being seated in the great hall as we speak, and if you draw his attention to this pack's dirty little secrets, I promise you'll regret it." He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling backward into the kitchen doorframe. The cook grabbed Alara's arm, steadying her, shooting Owen a nervous glance before dragging Elara back to the counter. "Don't be stupid, girl," the older woman hissed under her breath. "You want to survive this? You keep your head down and your mouth shut." But Elara couldn't hear her over the pounding of her own heart, over the phantom echoes of the children's screams still reverberating in her mind. In the boiler room, Finn would be trying to protect his siblings. Sage would be curling into herself, hands pressed over her ears, and Ash, sweet baby Ash, would be crying for her, his small body shaking with fever and fear. Alara's hands trembled as she knelt to clean up the ruined canapes. Through the kitchen service window, she could see into the great hall where the Pack's elite were assembling. Alpha Aldrich stood at the head of the massive oak dining table, his corporate smile fixed in place. Vivienne was beside him, resplendent in a designer dress, her ice blonde hair perfect, her posture radiating confidence she didn't feel. The betas and enforcers lined the table in descending order of rank, each one dressed in their finest, each one careful not to make eye contact with the man seated at the head, Kieran Thorne. Even from the kitchen, separated by walls and doors and the careful distance afforded to servants, Elara could see him clearly. The Alphaking was not what she'd expected. The stories had painted him as some kind of monster, all rage and brutality and supernatural power barely contained in human flesh. But the man seated at the table looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine. 6 feet 4 inches of lean, controlled strength, wrapped in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Elara earned in a year. His dark hair was cut short, professional, with just enough length on top to suggest he didn't obsess over his appearance. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic lines, handsome in a remote, untouchable way. But when he lifted his gaze, even at this distance, Elara could see something unsettling in those frost-pale eyes. They moved across the assembled pack with the detached interest of a predator assessing prey. He wasn't looking at people, he was looking at problems, at threats, at loose ends that needed tying up. Elara shivered and turned away, focusing on her hands on the simple task of cleaning up her mess. Don't look, don't draw attention, don't exist. In the great hall, the banquet began. Elara could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the service window as she worked. Aldrich was boasting about timber yields and territorial expansion, his voice too loud, too jovial, the false cheer of a man desperate to appear confident. Kieran's responses were minimal, single-word acknowledgments that offered no warmth, no engagement. The Alphaking was bored, no worse than bored. He was utterly uninterested in Aldrich's performance, his attention clearly focused elsewhere. Your ledgers are adequate, Aldrich. The king's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the ambient noise like a blade. The entire hall went silent. Even in the kitchen, the staff froze listening. But your border security is lax, Kieran continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. Almost. I noted 3 blind spots on the eastern ridge where a regiment could pass undetected. Care to explain how you've maintained territorial integrity with such glaring vulnerabilities? Aldrich's face went pale. Elara watched through the service window as the Alpha dabbed his forehead with a linen napkin, his corporate confidence crumbling. My king, I assure you those ridges are patrolled daily. We've had no incursions in do not assure me of lies. The words were quiet, but they landed like a physical blow. Aldrich's mouth snapped shut, his hands clenching on the edge of the table. Around him, the pack's elite shifted uncomfortably, heads, bowing shoulders, hunching in unconscious submission. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Kieran took a sip of his wine, perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. But Elara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his free hand rested casually on the table with fingers slightly curled, as if restraining the urge to curl into a fist. The Alphaking was hunting, and Aldrich had just revealed himself as prey. In the basement far below the careful theater of the banquet, disaster struck. The main water line that fed the estate's elaborate plumbing system was over 60 years old, a relic from the original construction that had been patched and repaired but never fully replaced. The sudden influx of guests, the simultaneous use of a dozen bathrooms, and the industrial kitchen put stress on the aging pipes that they were never designed to handle. In the boiler room directly beneath the guest quarters, the weakest section of pipe finally gave way. The rupture was catastrophic. Scalding water at nearly 200 degrees exploded through the ceiling in a pressurized torrent, punching through old plaster and rotting wood like it was tissue paper. The deluge hit the boiler room floor with the force of a flash flood, filling the small space within seconds. Elara felt it before she heard it, a tremor that ran through the foundation of the estate, subtle but unmistakable. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant groan of tortured metal and rushing water that vibrated up through the floor beneath her feet. Her head snapped toward the basement stairs. No, the word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute horror. Elara dropped the dish she'd been washing and ran. She didn't think, didn't calculate the risk, didn't consider what would happen if she was caught abandoning her post during a royal banquet. She just moved her body, operating on pure maternal instinct, driven by the primal need to get to her children. The cook shouted after her, Beta Owen turned from his position near the dining hall entrance, his eyes widening in fury. But Elara was already through the service door, already taking the basement stairs three at a time, her canvas shoes slipping on the worn wood. The basement corridor was flooded. Water rushed past her ankles hot enough to make her gasp, carrying debris and rust, and the acrid smell of corroded metal. The overhead lights flickered, throwing shadows that danced across the wet walls like demons. And from behind the iron door of the boiler room came the sounds that would haunt Alara's nightmares for the rest of her life. Children screaming in terror, the roar of cascading water, the hiss of steam. Elara slammed into the door, her fingers scrabbling at the lock. The metal was hot, scorching her palms, but she didn't care. She wrenched the door open, and a wave of superheated steam billowed out, enveloping her in wet heat that stole her breath. Finn, Sage, Ash. Through the steam, she could see them. Finn was standing on the cot, which was now an island in a rising flood. He had Sage pressed against the wall, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other hand gripping the copper pipe overhead to keep them from being swept away. And in his free arm, clutched against his narrow chest, was Ash. The toddler was sobbing, his face red and contorted, his small body shaking with terror. The water was rising fast. Already it had reached the edge of the cot. In another minute, maybe two, it would force the children off their precarious refuge. And the water pouring through the shattered ceiling was still scalding, hot enough to blister skin, on contact hot enough to kill. Elara didn't hesitate. She waded into the room, gasping, as the hot water soaked through her dress and bit into her legs. The current was stronger than she'd anticipated, pushing against her shins, her knees trying to knock her off balance. But she pushed forward, reaching the cot, stretching up toward Finn. "Give him to me." Finn's eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't argue. He lowered Ash into Alara's waiting arms, and she clutched the toddler against her chest, feeling his small heart hammering against her ribs. The scalding water splashed against her exposed arm, and Elara screamed, the pain bright and immediate. Blisters rose on her skin instantly, angry red welts that would scar. But she didn't drop Ash. She held him tighter, turning her body to shield him from the worst of the spray, and reached for Sage with her free hand. "Come on, sweetheart. We have to go. Now." Sage's eyes were glassy, unfocused. The dark veins beneath her skin were pulsing rapidly, spreading across her neck and down her chest in real time. The stress, the heat, the fear, it was all accelerating the poison's progression. The little girl's lips were turning blue. "Sage?" Elara's voice cracked with desperation. "Sage, look at me." Finn shook his sister roughly, and Sage's eyes cleared just enough to focus on Elara's face. She reached out with trembling hands, and Elara grabbed her, hauling the 5-year-old off the cot. Finn jumped last, landing in the flood with a splash that sent hot water cascading over all of them. They couldn't stay here. The water was still rising, and the temperature in the room was climbing as steam filled the air. They'd be boiled alive if they didn't move. But the back exit was locked. Elara had tried it 100 times over the past 4 months, testing every possible escape route in case of emergency. The heavy steel door that led to the exterior had been bolted from the outside, a security measure implemented by Owen to prevent servants from sneaking out during pack events. That left only one option: up, through the service stairs, across the back edge of the great hall where the royal banquet was still in progress. Out through the kitchen exit. It was suicide. If they were seen, if the Alphaking caught sight of 3 rogue pups in the middle of his audit, the punishment would be swift and final. Aldrich would have them executed on the spot to prove his pack's discipline. Owen would make good on his threat to skin them. But if they stayed, they'd drown. Elara made the choice in a heartbeat. "Follow me. Stay close. Don't make a sound." She hitched Ash higher on her hip, wrapped her burned arm around his small body despite the pain, and grabbed Sage's hand. Finn pressed against her back, his small hands fisted in the wet fabric of her dress. Together they moved through the flooded corridor, pushing against the current, climbing the service stairs on legs that shook with exhaustion and fear. The door at the top of the stairs opened onto a narrow hallway that ran parallel to the Great Hall. Elara could hear the banquet clearly, now the clink of silverware on china, the low murmur of forced conversation. Through the gaps in the decorative tapestries that lined the wall, she could see the assembled pack, see Alpha Aldrich's strained smile, see Kieran Thorne's cold assessing gaze. They had to cross behind those tapestries. Had to move through the shadows at the edge of the hall, past a dozen sets of eyes, past the most powerful alpha in North America, to reach the kitchen door on the far side. Elara pressed the children against the wall, her body forming a barrier between them and the hall. She wrapped her apron around Ash's shivering form, trying to muffle his whimpers. Sage was shaking so badly her teeth were chattering the dark veins on her neck, now spreading toward her jaw. Finn's fever-bright eyes met Elara's, and she saw her own fear reflected back at her. "We can do this," Elara whispered the words as much for herself as for them. "Keep your heads down. Follow my lead. Don't look at anyone." She took a breath, pressed a kiss to Ash's wet curls, and stepped into the shadows behind the tapestries. They moved like ghosts, silent and desperate, hugging the stone wall. The tapestries were thick, heavy things, depicting scenes of hunts and battles, and they provided just enough cover to hide 3 small children and 1 Omega if they stayed pressed flat against the wall. 20 feet. 15. 10. They were going to make it, and then a drunken enforcer stumbled backward from the table. He was one of Owen's men, a brutal thug named Marcus, who'd had too much wine and too little sense. He lurched away from his seat, laughing at some joke Elara hadn't heard, and his heavy boot came down hard on something soft. Sage's bare foot. The little girl's scream was instinctive, involuntary, a sharp cry of pain that cut through the ambient noise of the banquet like a knife. Every head in the room turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The enforcer looked down, his wine-flushed face registering confusion, then disgust. "What the hell?" He reached down, grabbing Sage by her thin shoulder and yanking her out from behind the tapestry. The little girl stumbled, falling to her knees on the polished slate, her burnt fabric clutched in white-knuckled hands. "I thought the Alpha said to lock up the garbage." Marcus raised his hand, palm open, aiming to backhand the child across the face. He never made contact. Finn moved with a speed that defied his malnourished frame, a feral screech tearing from his throat that was too large, too wild, too ancient for a 7-year-old boy. He launched himself not at the enforcer, but past him, his small body airborne for one impossible moment. He landed squarely in the center of the royal dining table. Crystal wine glasses shattered under the impact. Fine china plates skittered off the polished wood, crashing to the floor in an explosion of porcelain shards. A tureen of soup overturned, sending hot liquid cascading across the white tablecloth. Finn stood in the wreckage, dripping wet, covered in soot and rust stains, his thin chest heaving with exertion. And he was staring directly at Kieran Thorne. The silence that descended over the great hall was absolute. Even the fire in the massive stone hearth seemed to hold its breath. 24 pairs of eyes locked onto the child standing on the table, shock and horror warring across every face. Except one. Kieran Thorne sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Finn with an intensity that made the air around him shimmer with suppressed power. His expression was unreadable, but something shifted in his posture. Attention, an alertness, like a predator catching an unexpected scent. And then Finn, brave, foolish, desperate, Finn bared his teeth and let out a vicious, challenging roar, aimed directly at the Alphaking's face. The sound was primal, defiant, absolutely fearless. It echoed through the hall, bouncing off stone walls and vaulted ceilings, a child's declaration of war against a king. Aldrich's face drained of all color. He surged to his feet, his chair toppling backward. "Guards!" The Alpha's voice cracked with terror. "Guards, kill the rogue brat! Get it off the table!" 2 massive enforcers moved immediately, reaching for Finn with hands like bear traps. But Elara was faster. She threw herself forward, still clutching Ash against her chest, her burned arms screaming in protest. She slammed into the first guard's legs, using her body as a battering ram, sending him stumbling. The second guard's hand closed around her shoulder, yanking her back, but Elara twisted, putting herself between the guards and the table. Between them and Finn, Sage scrambled forward, her small hands finding Elara's leg, clinging desperately. Ash was sobbing against Elara's neck, his hot tears mixing with the dirty water soaking her dress. And above them all, Finn stood his ground on the table, his small body trembling, but his eyes locked on the king, still growling that impossible feral challenge. Elara dropped to her knees on the debris. The shards bit into her skin through the thin fabric of her dress, and she felt warm blood well up, mixing with the water and filth coating the floor. But she didn't care. She bowed her head so low it pressed against the wet floorboards, her entire body curled over Ash, shielding him with everything she had. "Please." Her voice was raw, desperate, breaking on the word. "Please, Alpha, have mercy. He's just a child. He doesn't know what he's doing." Her throat closed around the next words, but she forced them out anyway, offering the only thing she had left to bargain with. "Take my life. Punish me, but please, please spare them." Beta Owen roared from across the hall, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You stupid, worthless Omega, you've doomed us all!" He charged forward, claws extending from his fingertips with sharp snicks of bone and keratin. He wasn't aiming for the children. He was aiming for Elara, for her exposed neck, for the killing blow that would end this embarrassment before the Alpha King. Elara squeezed her eyes shut. She wrapped her arms tighter around. Ash felt Sage press against her side, felt Finn's small hand touch the top of her head in a gesture of protection he was too small to enforce. She braced for the agonizing sting of claws tearing through flesh, for the final darkness that would end her struggle. It never came. The sound that filled the hall was indescribable. A deafening concussive boom, like a thunderclap compressed into a single point of impact. The chandelier overhead swayed violently. Glasses on the table rattled, and Beta Owencade flew backward through the air as if hit by an invisible freight train. He crashed into a stone pillar 30 feet away with a sickening crunch of breaking bones. His body slid down the column like a puppet with cut strings landing in an unconscious heap at its base. Blood trickled from his nose, his mouth, his ears. Alara's eyes snapped open. Standing over her, radiating an aura so violently oppressive that half the room had been forced to their knees by its sheer weight, was Kieran Thorne. His eyes were no longer the pale blue she glimpsed from the kitchen. They were blazing with a brilliant, terrifying, luminescent silver that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The air around him shimmered with heat distortion, and Elara could feel the raw power rolling off him in waves that made her bones ache, and her Omega instincts scream at her to submit, to bare her throat, to acknowledge his absolute dominance. The royal guards had weapons drawn, but Kieran raised a single-gloved hand, and they froze instantly, obedient to the unspoken command. The Alpha King slowly lowered his gaze to the trembling Omega on the floor, to the 3 pups clustered around her like baby birds in a nest. Finn was still on the table above them, still growling despite the terror now visible in his eyes, his small legs shaking under the crushing pressure of the King's aura. But Kieran didn't look at Finn with anger. He looked at him with something far more dangerous: recognition. The King stepped closer, his boots crunching on broken glass and porcelain. Each footfall was deliberate, controlled the movement of a predator who knew its prey had nowhere left to run. He stopped directly in front of Elara, so close she could see the water droplets clinging to his expensive shoes, could smell the scent of ozone and dark pine that clung to his clothes. From across the hall, Aldrich's voice was high and desperate. "My king, I apologize profusely for this insult. They are rogue filth strays we found in the woods. I will have them destroyed immediately." Silence. The word wasn't shouted. It was delivered in a quiet, lethal tone that nevertheless carried to every corner of the hall. And with that single word, Aldrich's throat sealed shut. The Alpha clawed at his neck, his eyes bulging, but no sound emerged. He'd been commanded to silence by a power far greater than his own, and his body had no choice but to obey. Kieran crouched down, lowering himself until he was eye level with Elara. She was shaking so violently she could barely breathe, her scent sharp and pungent with fear. But beneath the terror, beneath the smell of damp clothes and rusty water and burned skin, Kieran's nostrils flared as he caught something else, something that made him go completely still. He looked past Elara to Finn, standing defiant and trembling on the table. The King studied the boy with an intensity that was almost physical, his silver eyes cataloging every detail. The matted hair, the malnutrition, the hollow cheeks, the fever-bright skin, and then his gaze focused on Finn's eyes. In the dim light of the basement, they'd appeared muddy gold. But here, under the brilliant light of the chandeliers, catching the reflection of dozens of candles, they showed their true color. Crystalline silver, the exact shade as the Alpha King's, a genetic marker exclusive to the Thorne royal bloodline. Kieran's breath hitched. His hand, which had been moving towards Sage where she clung to Elara's leg, trembled. He gently touched the ragged piece of fabric the little girl was clutching with white-knuckled desperation, and Elara watched his face transform. The fabric wasn't flannel. It wasn't a blanket or a comfort item from some lost home. It was a torn, burnt shred of a royal guard's cloak. The distinctive deep blue wool, the silver threading along the edge, the crest that had been half burned away, but was still visible if you knew what to look for. Kieran's throat worked as he swallowed hard. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion the ruthless Alpha King hadn't displayed in 6 months. "Where did you get these children?" The question was directed at Elara, but she couldn't answer. Her throat was closed with terror, her mind blank with shock. She could only stare up at him, tears streaming down her dirty face, her arms locked around Ash like iron bands. Her voice cracked. She swallowed, tried again. "I didn't. The border patrols found them. 4 months ago. They were going to let them die in the cold." Her eyes dropped to the children, and when she looked back at the Alpha King, there was something beyond fear in her gaze. There was desperate, fierce love. "I just kept them warm. Her voice broke completely. "Please, my king, they are good pups. They need me." Kieran finished the sentence, his eyes snapping to the dark veins spiderwebbing beneath Sage's pale skin. He recognized the symptom immediately, his medical training from decades of warfare kicking in with perfect clarity. Nightshade wolfsbane, a slow-acting poison so rare and so expensive it could only be acquired through black market channels. A poison specifically designed to suppress royal werewolf traits and slowly kill the host over months, making the death appear natural. And then the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Kieran leaned forward, and before Elara could flinch away, he buried his face against the curve of her neck, inhaling deeply. The entire pack gasped at the intimate gesture, the breach of protocol, but Kieran didn't care. He wasn't claiming her. He was diagnosing a miracle. Elara's omega scent hit him like a physical force. The familiar sweetness, yes, but underneath those notes was something extraordinary. A biological signature he'd only read about in ancient medical texts. Her scent was laced with a rare natural enzyme found in perhaps 1 in a million omegas. An enzyme that acted as a neutralizing agent for Aconitum napellus compounds. An enzyme that was the only known natural antidote to nightshade wolfsbane. Her proximity to the children, her constant physical contact, her scent saturating their clothing and skin, it had been acting as a continuous biological dialysis. She wasn't just comforting them, she was keeping the poison from reaching their hearts. She had been unknowingly keeping his dead sister's children alive for 4 months. Kieran stood slowly, the shock in his silver eyes hardening into something so dark, so terrifyingly violent, that the chandeliers overhead began to rattle from the sheer force of his suppressed rage. "These are not rogue runts," his voice echoed through the hall like a judge's gavel. "This is Prince Finn, Princess Sage, and Prince Ash, the lost heirs to the Eastern Territory, the children of my sister, Princess Lyanna Thorne." He turned his head slowly to look at Alpha Aldrich Vale, who was still clawing at his throat, his face purple with oxygen deprivation. "And they were found on your land, Aldrich, suffering from a poison that only high-ranking nobles have access to, a poison someone administered before dropping them in the woods to die a slow, deniable death." Kieran released his command over Aldrich's throat, and the Alpha collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. "Someone," Kieran continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall, "operating within your territory." He looked back at Elara, who was staring up at him with wise, doe-like eyes, still clutching the royal heirs to her chest with desperate strength. "You." Kieran pointed a sharp finger at her, his tone shifting from wrathful king to something fierce and protective. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not let them go." Then he turned to face the trembling pack, and his royal guards unsheathed their silver blades in perfect unison. The heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed shut with a resounding boom that shook dust from the rafters. The sound of heavy iron bolts sliding into place echoed like gunshots. Kieran had sealed the room with his own power. No one was leaving until he allowed it. "Tonight," the Alphaking announced, a cruel, predatory smile curving his lips as he cracked his knuckles. "The audit is no longer about timber yields and border security." His eyes swept across the assembled pack, each member frozen in place under the weight of his terrible attention. "No one leaves this room until I find out exactly whose hands are stained with my sister's blood." Captain Rowan Storm, the Alpha King's towering lead guard, moved with military precision to the grand doors. The heavy iron crossbar slid into place with a resounding clank that echoed through the cavernous hall like a death knell. The ambient temperature plummeted. What little warmth the fireplace had provided was swallowed by the suffocating weight of Kieran Thorne's killing intent. Aldrich Vale remained on his knees, his tailored suit soaking up the puddle of rusty boiler water that had trailed in from the hallway. His hands pressed against the slate floor, palms flat, head bowed in a posture of complete submission. But submission wouldn't save him now. Nothing would. Kieran didn't look at the fallen Alpha. His gaze no longer silver, the rage temporarily banked beneath iron control, was focused entirely on the shivering pile of bodies on the floor. Elara was still huddled over the 3 royal heirs. Prince Finn had collapsed from exhaustion, his small body draped across her back, his face pressed against her shoulder. The adrenaline that had fueled his impossible challenge had burned through him like wildfire, and now the nightshade wolfsbane was rushing back to fill the void. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his skin gray beneath the grime. Princess Sage was quietly crying into Elara's soaked apron, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The dark veins on her neck pulsed with an angry rhythm, spreading visibly across her jaw and down toward her collarbone. And Prince Ash clung to Elara's neck with the desperate strength of a child who knew it on some primal level that she was the only thing standing between him and oblivion. Kieran unbuttoned his bespoke charcoal suit jacket, a garment worth more than most pack members earned in a year, and stripped it off with deliberate care. The assembled nobles watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King, the most powerful werewolf in North America, knelt onto the wet glass-strewn floor. He moved slowly, telegraphing his intentions, giving Elara time to process what was happening. When he was close enough to touch, he gently draped the heavy silk-lined jacket over her and the children, enveloping them in fabric that still carried the warmth of his body and the potent scent of his authority. The calming notes of pine and ozone earth and something indefinably alpha that made Elara's omega instincts sing with recognition even through her terror. The children's breathing immediately began to even out. Finn's fever-flushed skin cooled by several degrees. Sage's crying quieted to hiccuping gasps. Even the dark veins beneath her skin seemed to slow their relentless progression, as if the king's scent itself carried healing properties. Captain Storm, Kieran commanded without turning his head, his voice carrying the sharp authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. "Yes, Your Majesty." Rowan stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his silver-forged tactical blade. He was a mountain of a man nearly 7 feet tall, with the build of a linebacker and the cold efficiency of a professional soldier. His dark eyes swept the room, cataloging threats, calculating angles. "Contact Dr. Arthur Pendleton at Seattle State. Tell him I need a pediatric toxicology team airborne in 5 minutes. 3 cases of advanced nightshade wolfsbane poisoning. They will require immediate blood transfusions and marrow stabilizers." Kieran's gaze dropped to Elara, to the angry red blisters rising on her exposed arm, where the scalding water had burned through skin. She'd wrapped herself around the children so completely that she'd taken the worst of the burns herself. "And tell them to prepare a trauma suite for a female Omega," he added, his voice softening just a fraction. "She has second-degree burns and lacerations. Possible shock." Elara blinked up at him, her doe-like eyes wide with confusion and exhaustion. I'm fine," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just help them. Please, my king." Something shifted in Kieran's expression, a crack in the armor of cold calculation. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and his large, warm hand came to rest on the back of Elara's head. The touch was gentle, reverent, almost completely at odds with the brutal power he'd displayed moments ago. "You have done your duty, little wolf," he murmured, and there was an undeniable pull in his chest as he inhaled that familiar sweetness, a recognition his wolf was screaming at him to acknowledge. "Now I will do mine." He stood towering over the room once more. The brief moment of gentleness vanished beneath the terrifying visage of the Alpha King. He turned his attention to the crowd of terrified pack members pressed against the walls, their faces pale, their bodies rigid with fear. "Nightshade wolfsbane," Kieran began, pacing slowly along the length of the dining table like a caged predator, "is not a weed you accidentally forage in the Montana pines. It is a highly regulated black market botanical native to the deep Amazon rainforest. It costs upwards of $50,000 per ounce." He let that number sink in, watching recognition dawn on several faces. "To acquire enough to steadily dose 3 royal pups for 4 months without killing them outright requires more than money. It requires expertise, a precision operation, a steady supply chain." He stopped pacing and stared down at Aldrich. "It requires deep pockets and careful planning." The Alpha's face had gone from purple to ashen white. "You claim you are just a logging company, Aldrich. Just simple businessmen managing timber, yields, and freight logistics." Kieran's voice dripped with contempt. "Yet my sister's convoy was ambushed on Route 9 less than 20 miles from your primary freight depot. The attack was coordinated, professional, executed with military precision. And 1 month later, 3 rogue pups miraculously appear on your borders, heavily drugged, reeking of ash and accelerant." He leaned down to bringing his face level with Aldrich's. "Your pack just happened to toss them into a freezing kennel and let nature take its course. Very convenient. No blood on anyone's hands, no questions asked." "The patrols?" Aldrich's voice was barely a rasp. "The border patrols found them. I didn't question it. We have rogues crossing from Canada all the time. I swear on the goddess, I didn't know." "Who was the patrol captain on duty that night?" The question came from Captain Rowan Storm, who had moved to stand beside a trembling woman in designer clothing. "CFO. Beatrice Caldwell clutched her tablet to her chest like a shield, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. Silence descended over the hall, heavy and suffocating. Kieran's eyes began to glow silver again, just a faint luminescence that made the air around him shimmer with barely contained violence. "I will ask once more," he said softly, And if I have to ask a third time, I will start removing body parts until someone develops the courage to answer. Who found the pups? From the back of the room, a sharp manicured hand rose. Beatrice Caldwell was pointing toward the stone pillar where Beta Owen Cade still lay unconscious, blood crusted around his nose and ears. It was Beta Owen, Your Majesty. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. Owen Cade and his lead enforcers. They brought the children in that night. Kieran's gaze shifted to the unconscious Beta, then swept across the room until it landed on a woman pressed against the far wall. Vivian Cross, Owen's mate. Her ice-blonde hair had come loose from its severe knot strands, framing her face in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Her pale green eyes were wide with the glazed shock of someone watching their world collapse in real time. She took a stumbling step backward, her hands raised in a warding gesture. Beatrice is lying, Vivian said, her voice high and desperate. She's just trying to save her own skin because her financial ledgers are a mess. She's been embezzling for years. Are they? Kieran snapped his fingers. Captain Rowan crossed the room in 3 massive strides, plucking the tablet from Beatrice's trembling hands. His fingers moved across the screen with surprising dexterity for such a large man, bypassing encrypted firewalls with a royal override code that granted him access to every digital record Ironwood Timber and Logistics possessed. The room waited in agonizing suspense. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Elara could hear nothing but her own heartbeat and the quiet wheezing of Sage's labored breathing against her chest. Rowan's expression darkened as he scanned the data. When he looked up, his eyes locked onto Vivian Cross with the cold precision of a sniper acquiring a target. Your Majesty, his voice was grim. The Q3 logistics manifests show a recurring unlisted expenditure, hidden under a line item labeled heavy machinery maintenance. 3 separate wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, totaling $750,000. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled pack members. The account, Rowan continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, is registered to a shell corporation. He paused, letting the silence stretch taut. A corporation named Cross Holdings. Vivian's face went from pale to gray. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. Furthermore, Rowan's eyes never left her face. There is a shipping manifest for a specialized climate-controlled biocontainer that arrived at the Ironwood Ridge Freight Depot exactly 3 days before Princess Leanna's convoy was attacked. The manifest lists the contents as rare botanical samples requiring temperature stability. The container was signed for personally by Beta Owen Cade. The trap had snapped shut. Corporate espionage and the ancient bloody laws of the werewolf world had collided with devastating precision. Kieran walked slowly toward Vivian. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, desperate to put distance between themselves and the king's wrath. When he stood before her, Vivian's knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor, her designer dress pooling around her like a deflated balloon. You bought the poison, Kieran stated. Not a question. A fact delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. You facilitated the ambush. And when the assassins realized my sister had hidden the pups in the woods before she was slaughtered, your mate was tasked with hunting them down and finishing the job. No! Vivian shrieked, tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. We didn't know they were royals. We were just paid to dispose of some rogue kids. A contractor reached out to Owen, offered $5 million to make them disappear quietly. We thought they were just unwanted pups from a rival pack. We didn't know. The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Kieran's voice dropped to a register that vibrated the windows in their frames. Who was the contractor? Before Vivian could answer, a guttural, furious roar shattered the interrogation. Owen Cade had regained consciousness. The Beta, nursing a shattered collarbone and a fractured skull, realized the depth of his exposure the instant he heard his mate confessing. He knew pack law, knew the ancient codes. Treason against the crown wasn't just a death sentence for the perpetrator. It was the systematic eradication of the entire bloodline. Children, parents, siblings, anyone who shared the traitor's blood would be hunted down and executed to prevent the stain of betrayal from spreading. Owen had nothing left to lose. With the desperate, blinding speed of a cornered animal, he lunged. His broken body moved on pure adrenaline and rage claws extending from fingertips, eyes wild with the madness of a man facing oblivion. But he didn't go for Kieran. That would be instant death. He didn't go for Rowan. The captain would cut him down before he took 2 steps. He went for the weakest link, the prize that was currently keeping the heirs alive. He went straight for Elara. If I die, Owen roared, spittle flying from his lips. The royal brats die with me. Everything happened in the space between heartbeats. The royal guards drew their weapons, but Owen was too close, already committed to his trajectory. Prince Finn let out a tiny, ferocious snarl and tried to place himself between Owen and Elara, but his small legs gave out the poison, sapping the last of his strength. Sage screamed a sound of pure terror that had no sonic component, just raw fear. And Elara didn't hesitate. Decades of abuse at the hands of Aldrich's pack had taught her one fundamental truth. Survival meant taking the hit. She twisted her body with practiced efficiency, throwing herself entirely over Ash and Sage, exposing her back to Owen's incoming claws. Her eyes squeezed shut, her arms locked around the children with desperate strength. She waited for the fatal strike, for the tearing of flesh and the sharp, bright pain of dying. It never came. The sound that filled the hall was visceral and wet, the crack of bones breaking, the squelch of flesh parting, the heavy thud of a body hitting wood. Elara flinched, but she felt no pain. Warm blood splattered across her cheek, running down her jaw in thick rivulets. But it wasn't hers. Slowly she opened her eyes and looked up. Kieran Thorne stood directly in front of her, so close she could have reached out and touched his legs. His right hand was buried wrist-deep in Owen Cade's chest cavity. The beta was suspended in the air, impaled on the Alphaking's arm, his eyes wide with shock and the terrible understanding of his own death. Blood bubbled from his lips, running down his chin in a crimson stream. Kieran had moved faster than the human eye could track, faster than physics should allow. He'd intercepted Owen's leap with lethal absolute precision, catching the beta midair and driving his hand through muscle and bone to crush the heart beneath. "You," Kieran whispered, and his voice carried the dual-toned resonance of a wolf speaking through human vocal cords, demonic and utterly inhuman. "Do not touch what is mine." With a brutal, effortless motion, he withdrew his hand. Owen's body collapsed to the polished wood floor, dead before gravity finished pulling him down. The beta's eyes stared sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling, his final expression frozen in shock. Vivian Cross let out a blood-curdling scream. The mate bond, that mystical connection between paired wolves, severed like a cut rope. The psychic backlash hit her like a sledgehammer, and she collapsed to the floor, clawing at her own chest, her mind fragmenting under the trauma of sudden violent loss. Several of the Ironwood Ridge pack members turned away, hands pressed to their mouths. The scent of blood and death and the overwhelming musk of royal dominance saturated the air, thick enough to choke on. Kieran pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and calmly wiped the blood from his hand. He didn't spare a second glance at the corpse. His attention was already moving on, focused on the weeping widow curled on the floor. "Captain Storm." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Arrest Vivian Cross. Lock her in the royal dungeon at the Seattle estate. She will be interrogated by the Inquisitors until she provides the name of the contractor who paid them. Then she will be executed for high treason against the crown." "Yes, Your Majesty." Two guards moved forward, immediately hauling Vivian to her feet. She fought them weakly, her body racked with sobs, her mind shattered. They dragged her from the hall, her screams echoing through the corridors long after the doors closed behind them. Kieran then turned to Alpha Aldrich Vale, who had been watching the execution with the glazed eyes of a man in shock. The former Alpha was weeping openly, his face pressed against the wet floor, his expensive suit ruined beyond repair. "Aldrich Vale," Kieran's voice boomed across the silent hall, carrying the weight of royal judgment. "Through your gross negligence, your incompetence, and your failure to monitor your own pack's financial activities, you allowed a treasonous cell to operate on your land. You allowed my sister to be murdered. You allowed my nephew and nieces to be tortured in your own backyard for 4 months while you played at being a timber baron." "Mercy," Aldrich sobbed, the word muffled against the slate. "Alphaking, I beg of you, take my lands, take my company, just spare my life." Well, no, Kieran's smile was colder than the Montana winter. "I am taking everything, Aldrich. As of this moment, the Ironwood Ridge pack is dissolved. Your assets, your logging contracts, your territories, all of it now belongs to the crown. You are stripped of your Alpha title. You and your board members will be transported to the northern labor camps to serve out the remainder of your pathetic lives breaking rocks and clearing timber." A collective wail went up from the high-ranking pack members, but a single glare from Kieran silenced them instantly. The royal guards moved in with practiced efficiency, securing Aldrich and his betas with silver-lined cuffs that sizzled against their skin. The former Alpha didn't resist. He'd aged 20 years in the span of an hour, his shoulders slumped, his eyes empty. With the immediate threats neutralized, the oppressive, terrifying aura that had been crushing the room slowly began to dissipate. Kieran took a deep breath, fighting to push his roaring, bloodthirsty wolf back beneath the surface of his control. He needed to be calm, needed to be safe. He turned back to where Elara still knelt. She was trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. She was covered in his suit jacket, soaked in rusty water and blood. Most of it not hers. Her arms were still locked around the three royal children with desperate, unbreakable strength. Prince Finn had passed out completely, his head resting on her collarbone, his breathing shallow and reedy. Princess Sage was crying silently into Alara's apron, her small hands fisted in the fabric. And Prince Ash was gripping Alara's hair, with both tiny fists, his face buried against her neck. Kieran crouched beside her. He reached out, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before gently resting his large, warm hand on the back of Alara's head. The same gesture as before, but this time it carried a different weight. Not just comfort, something deeper, something his wolf was screaming at him to acknowledge. "It's over," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the monster who had just executed a man with his bare hand. "You are safe now. They are safe." Elara looked up at him. Her large doe-like eyes were filled with a mixture of terror, awe, and an exhaustion so profound it seemed to radiate from her bones. "They need a doctor," she whispered, her voice cracking. She looked down at Sage at the dark veins that were spreading again, spurred on by the stress of the attack. "The veins are spreading. I can feel them getting worse." Kieran examined his niece's neck. The poison was indeed advancing, rushing to fill the void left by adrenaline and fear. "Dr. Pendleton's helicopter was still minutes away and every second counted." "I know," Kieran said, and then making a decision that went against every protocol, every security measure, every royal tradition, he carefully scooped Elara up into his arms. She was so light, too light. Malnutrition and years of abuse had left her weighing barely more than the children she protected. Kieran refused to separate her from the pups clinging to her. Instinct told him that would cause more harm than good. So he lifted all four of them together, cradling Elara against his broad chest, while the children remained pressed against her. Elara gasped, her body going rigid, expecting to be dropped or reprimanded for daring to touch the king. But Kieran held her securely, adjusting his grip to support her weight and the children's. Despite the blood soaking his shirt, despite the violence he'd just committed, he smelled like safety, like protection, like home. "Captain," Kieran called over his shoulder as he carried his precious cargo toward the grand exit. "Sire." Rowan fell into step beside him, his hand still resting on his blade hilt. "Secure the perimeter. Have the medical helicopter land directly on the front lawn. Prepare my private jet for immediate departure." "Where to, Your Majesty?" Kieran looked down at the bruised, beautiful Omega in his arms, at that familiar sweetness that wrapped around his heart like an iron band. For 4 months, this nameless outcast had loved his family when the world had abandoned them to die. She had taken their pain, borne their suffering, and offered her life for theirs without a second thought. "We're going to the capital," Kieran stated, stepping out into the cool Montana night. The stars overhead were brilliant and indifferent, ancient witnesses to the justice that had been delivered. "And we're taking their mother with us." The royal helicopter descended onto the front lawn of the Ironwood estate with the thunderous whump of rotor blades cutting through mountain air. Medical personnel poured out before the skids even touched grass, their movements choreographed with the precision of a trauma team that had worked together for years. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the royal physician, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He took one look at the children clustered against Elara and began barking orders. "I need 3 pediatric gurneys. Start IV lines on all 3, normal saline wide open. Someone get me vitals and a temp strip. And get a line in the Omega too, she's showing signs of shock." Elara tried to protest, tried to tell them she was fine, but her voice wouldn't work. Her body had finally reached its limit. The adrenaline that had kept her moving through the flood and the confrontation was crashing hard, leaving her hollow and shaking. Kieran carried her up the helicopter's ramp himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her. During the flight, he changed into a clean dark Henley, one of the guards handed him, but never released his hold on Elara and the children. He settled into one of the reinforced seats, still cradling them against his chest. The medical team worked around him, inserting IVs, attaching monitors, wrapping the burns on Elara's arm with specialized gauze. Through it all, Kieran never let go. The flight to Seattle took 43 minutes. 43 minutes of watching Princess Sage's heart rate drop on the monitor. 43 minutes of Prince Finn's shallow, labored breathing. 43 minutes of Prince Ash clinging to Elara Bar with the desperate strength of a child who knew on some level that letting go meant dying. and 43 minutes of Kieran staring at the Omega who had saved his family, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. A recognition, a claiming, a bond forming that had nothing to do with scent markers or mystical fate and everything to do with choice. He had chosen her. And his wolf, for the first time in 6 months, was at peace. The Thorn Global Sovereign Estate rose from the shores of Lake Washington like a fortress carved from glass and steel. To the human billionaires who shared the affluent Medina zip code, it was the reclusive stronghold of an eccentric tech magnate. To the supernatural world, it was the impenetrable seat of the Alphaking's power. The helicopter landed on the private helipad. Gurneys were waiting. The children were transferred with gentle efficiency, rushed through underground corridors to the medical wing that rivaled the trauma centers at the best human hospitals. Elara was placed on her own gurney, but she fought the restraints, her eyes wild with panic. "The children, I need to stay with them." "You will," Kieran said firmly, walking beside her gurney as they moved through the sterile white corridors. "Dr. Pendleton will treat you in the same room. I give you my word." And he kept it. The medical bay was a massive space filled with state-of-the-art equipment. 3 examination tables held the royal heirs, their small bodies dwarfed by the technology surrounding them. Intravenous lines pumped aggressive cocktails into their veins, lipid emulsions to bind the fat-soluble poison, activated charcoal to absorb toxins, electrolyte solutions to support failing organs. Elara was placed on a 4th table in the corner, close enough to see the children, but out of the medical team's way. A nurse cleaned and dressed, her burns applied butterfly bandages to the cuts on her knees, wrapped her blistered feet in cooling gel packs. Through it all, Kieran stood near the reinforced glass doors watching. His silver eyes flicked constantly between his dying family and the small, terrified Omega who had kept them alive. "Doctor." Pendleton approached the king, stripping off his latex gloves with sharp snaps. His expression was grave. "Your Majesty, we need to confirm enzyme compatibility before we can proceed with extraction. The lipid therapy is holding for now, but we're running out of time. Princess Sage's condition is deteriorating fastest." Kieran's jaw clenched. "Do what you need to do, Arthur. Just save them." Pendleton turned toward Elara. "Miss Brennan, we need to run some tests. May I?" Before Elara could respond, the heavy steel security doors of the medical base shuddered violently. A localized explosive charge detonated against the reinforced locks with a sharp crack that made everyone in the room flinch. The doors blew inward, torn from their hinges, in a cloud of thick, acrid gray smoke. Dr. Pendleton and his nurses dropped to the floor immediately, professional training overriding panic. But Elara tried to sit up, tried to reach for the children, even from her table across the room. Through the smoke stepped 5 men in tactical gear, armed with silver-laced assault rifles and faces hidden behind black balaclavas. Mercenaries, professional killers hired by someone with deep pockets and no conscience. The lead mercenary raised his weapon toward the surgical tables. "Kill the brats, leave no witnesses." His finger began to squeeze the trigger. He never completed the motion. A blur of dark, monstrous speed slammed into him from the side. Kieran Thorne didn't shift into his wolf form. He didn't need to. Operating on pure, unrestrained alpha power, he moved faster than human eyes could track, appearing beside the mercenary as if he'd teleported. His hand closed around the man's throat and squeezed. The wet crunch of cartilage collapsing echoed through the bay. Kieran used the dying mercenary's body as a shield, catching a burst of silver bullets meant for him. Then he hurled the corpse at the next closest attacker with enough force to shatter ribs. Captain Rowan followed a heartbeat later, his tactical blade singing through the air in a lethal, precise dance. 2 more mercenaries dropped before they could acquire their targets. Throats opened in clean horizontal lines. But in the chaos, one mercenary slipped past the king and his guard. He vaulted over a medical cart combat boots, finding purchase on sterile tile, and raised his sidearm directly at the unconscious Princess Sage, lying defenseless on the examination table. And Elara moved. She didn't think. Maternal instinct overrode every shred of self-preservation, every ounce of exhaustion, every scream of protest from her abused body. The Omega, who had spent 6 years learning to take punishment without fighting back, suddenly became something feral and unstoppable. Elara launched herself off her table with a desperate, inarticulate scream that carried 4 months of suppressed rage and fear and absolute refusal to let her children die. She tackled the armored mercenary around his knees just as his finger squeezed the trigger. The shot went wild, shattering a glass cabinet of medical supplies in an explosion of glittering fragments. The mercenary cursed, his carefully aimed execution disrupted by 90 pounds of feral Omega attached to his legs. He kicked viciously, his boot connecting with Elara's ribs with a crack that echoed through the bay. Elara collapsed, gasping for air, her vision going white with pain. But even as she fell, her hand closed around a discarded oxygen tank that had rolled free from the destroyed cabinet. Heavy, solid, a weapon. The mercenary leveled his gun at her face point-blank range, preparing to end the inconvenient obstacle between him and his target. Elara swung the oxygen tank upward with every ounce of strength left in her battered body. The heavy metal cylinder connected with the mercenary's kneecap with a sickening crunch. The joint shattered, bone fragmenting, ligaments tearing. The man went down, howling, his gun clattering across the floor. Captain Rowan stepped forward and finished what Elara had started, a single efficient strike to the temple, dropping the mercenary into unconsciousness that would slide seamlessly into death. The medical bay fell silent save for the frantic beeping of heart rate monitors and the ragged breathing of survivors processing trauma. Kieran Thorne stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing with brilliant, terrifying silver light. Blood painted his hands and forearms. None of it his own. He looked at the broken bodies of the assassins, and then his gaze snapped to Elara. She was curled on the floor between two examination tables, clutching her broken ribs, her face twisted with pain. But she was desperately trying to crawl back toward the pups' tables, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on blood-slick tile. Kieran crossed the room in 2 strides. He dropped to his knees beside her, his massive hands trembling as they hovered over her body, afraid to touch, afraid to cause more damage. "You foolish, brave, beautiful creature," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 6 months. He carefully gathered her into his arms, cradling her against his broad chest with a gentleness that belied the violence he'd just committed. "I have you. You're safe now." Elara looked up at him through a haze of pain and exhaustion. His silver eyes were softening, the killing light fading into something warm and luminous and utterly focused on her. "The pups," she managed to gasp out. "Are they? We need to work fast." Dr. Pendleton's voice cut through, shaky but determined. The elderly physician slowly stood from behind the surgical table where he'd taken cover, his wire-rimmed glasses askew. "Your Majesty, Miss Brennan's enzyme is our only option, but I need to extract a significant volume. Given her current state, the broken ribs, the blood loss from her earlier injuries, this is extremely risky." "Do it," a small, pained voice said. Everyone turned. Elara had pushed herself up in Kieran's arms, her face pale but her eyes clear. "Take whatever you need," she said, looking directly at Dr. Pendleton. "I don't care about the risk. Just save them." "Elara," Kieran's arms tightened around her, "you don't have to do this. I will not order you to give your life." She turned to meet his gaze. For the first time in her 22 years, Elara Brennan stood her ground before an alpha and spoke her truth. "You don't have to order me, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "They are your blood, but they are my heart. They're the only family I've ever known." Her eyes filled with tears. "Please." Kieran stared into her eyes, and something ancient and primal rose within him. Not the demand for dominance that defined his relationship with every other wolf in his kingdom. Something else entirely. A fierce, overwhelming urge to claim her, to protect her, to cherish her. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in their society. A broken, battered woman who had every reason to hate the world and everyone in it. Yet she possessed the soul of a warrior queen. And his wolf was roaring its absolute, undeniable submission to her spirit. "Do it safely, Arthur," Kieran said, his voice rough. "Monitor her vitals constantly. If she shows any sign of critical distress, you stop immediately." As the medical team prepped Elara for the blood extraction, Captain Rowan Storm stepped through the shattered doors, pulling Kieran into the hallway. "Sire," Rowan murmured, handing him an encrypted tablet. "The Inquisitors broke Vivian Cross. The contractor was Lord Thaddeus Ashford, head of the North American Lichen Council." Kieran's blood turned to ice. "He's here," Rowan continued grimly. "Arrived 10 minutes ago with 30 mercenaries. These 5 were his advance team. He knows Vivian was captured. He's here to eliminate the witnesses." Kieran's aura condensed into something terrifying. Absolute zero cold. "Lock down this wing. No one gets in. Find Ashford." His voice was devoid of emotion, now replaced by royal certainty. "Take him alive. I want him to face public execution." Inside the medical bay, Elara lay on a surgical cot, a catheter drawing her blood into a centrifuge. Her face was ashen, but her eyes remained locked on Finn, who was beginning to stir as her purified serum entered his system. The dark veins on his neck were slowly, visibly receding. It was working. Hours later, the sun rose over Lake Washington. In the medical wing, 3 royal children slept peacefully for the first time in 4 months. The dark veins had faded from their skin. Their breathing was deep and even, and beside their beds, wrapped in blankets, sat Elara. She refused to leave them even after Dr. Pendleton had treated her broken ribs and wrapped her in enough bandages to outfit a small hospital. Even after Kieran had carried her to a recovery suite and ordered her to rest. She'd waited until he left, then limped back on gauze-wrapped feet and climbed into the chair between the children's beds. That's where Kieran found her an hour later, her hand resting on Prince Finn's arm, her head tilted back, finally asleep. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. This Omega who had shattered every expectation, who had proven that true strength had nothing to do with claws or fangs or rank. True strength was the quiet courage to love fiercely in a world determined to break you. 3 days later, the courtyard of the Thorne estate filled with representatives from every pack in North America. They came to witness justice. Lord Thaddeus Ashford knelt on the execution platform in silver chains, his expensive suit torn and bloodied from the Inquisitor's work. The evidence was incontrovertible shipping manifests signed in his hand, encrypted communications traced to his personal devices, Vivian Cross's full confession, recorded and verified. Kieran Thorne stood before the assembled council, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Thaddeus Ashford, you are convicted of high treason against the crown, of conspiracy to assassinate Princess Lyanna Thorne, of attempted murder of 3 royal heirs, of corruption of your council position and betrayal of the pack laws you swore to uphold. The former council head's execution was swift. Kieran granted him that mercy, though he deserved none. A single stroke, and the man who had orchestrated his sister's death joined her in the void. 2 weeks later, the council chambers erupted when Kieran announced his intention to claim Elara Brennan as his queen. Councillor Edmund Frost, an old guard traditionalist, surged to his feet. Your Majesty, this Omega has no lineage, no pack standing. The crown can do whatever I decree. Kieran interrupted, his voice cutting through the protest like a blade. Elara Brennan saved the future of this kingdom when trained warriors, intelligence networks, and noble houses, including this council, failed catastrophically. She proved that true power resides not in bloodlines or rank, but in the courage to protect what you love. He looked across the assembled counselors, his silver eyes daring anyone to challenge him further. Those who cannot accept an Omega as your queen are welcome to resign immediately. The chamber fell silent. One by one, every council member bowed their heads in acceptance. The mating ceremony was private, held in the estate gardens with only the 3 children as witnesses. Finn served as ring bearer, his silver eyes bright with joy as he watched Mama E become Queen Mama. Sage scattered wildflowers along the path, and Ash, still recovering his strength, dozed contentedly in Dr. Pendleton's arms. When Kieran marked Elara's neck with the claiming bite binding them as mates before the moon goddess, she marked him in return, a symbolic equality that sent ripples through the watching supernatural world. 6 months later, the transformation was undeniable. The Omega Protection Act passed the council unanimously, granting legal rights and protection from abuse to the lowest-ranking pack members. The former Ironwood territories were redistributed to smaller packs who had been landless for generations. 3 Omegas, including a former servant from Aldrich's own pack house, now sat on regional councils, their voices finally heard. Aldrich Vale and his board members were indeed breaking rocks in the northern camps. Their empire dissolved, their crimes paying out in hard labor. And in the gardens of the Thorne estate, where spring had returned in full glory, 3 royal children played without fear for the first time in their young lives. Prince Finn, now 8 years old, was teaching Princess Sage to read from a book of myths and legends. His crystalline eyes, so like his uncle's, tracked the words with fierce concentration. Princess Sage, 6 years old and fully recovered, sounded out each syllable with careful precision, her fingers no longer clutching burnt fabric, but holding her brother's hand. Prince Ash, 4 now and robust with health, built elaborate towers from wooden blocks, narrating epic battles between imaginary kingdoms. Watching them from the stone terrace, Queen Elara Thorne stood wrapped in her mate's arms. The scars on her arms from the scalding water had faded to thin silver lines, badges she wore without shame. Her title was still new enough to feel strange, but the weight of Kieran's love, the children's laughter, the knowledge that she had shattered an unjust system that felt right. They're getting faster, Kieran noted, watching Finn chase a silver-furred guard dog through the roses. They're getting happier, Elara corrected, leaning into his warmth. That's what matters. Kieran turned her in his arms, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. The possessive love in his silver eyes still stole her breath, even after 6 months of marriage. You changed the world, little wolf. Elara smiled, that quiet warrior queen smile that had brought an alpha king to his knees. We changed it together. And in the end, that was the truth the Ironwood Ridge Pack had failed to understand. Rank didn't measure strength, titles didn't guarantee worth. The heart of a wolf was measured by its loyalty, its courage, and its capacity to love fiercely in a world determined to break it. By lifting the lowest among them to the highest seat of power, Kieran Thorne hadn't just saved his family. He had proven that true leadership meant recognizing strength wherever it appeared, even in bruised feet and trembling hands, and in Omega, who refused to let her children die in the dark. The old hierarchy was broken. And from its ashes rose a kingdom where courage mattered more than birth, where love proved stronger than tradition, and where an Omega became a queen, not through magic or fate, but through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to stop fighting for those she loved.